That's what a family does. It's the order of things. And I really think like there is a certain segment of our political makeup in this country, of political leaders, who don't want that order. That order is catastrophic to them, because order creates all of this peace in the family and this time to contemplate what is truly good for you. And with that, you come out being much more conservative values, much more traditional, much more religious. But it's these things like abortion and contraception and surrogacy and homosexuality and divorce that they do everything they can to make access to these things a lot easier. And all of these things, the thing they have in common is they create less families. They need to make a decision. Like, what's your decision? Is Christ who he said he is? Yes or no? Like, let's man up a little bit. That's what fatherhood's about, right?
That's our good man guest this week, someone I just can't vouch for. Kidding, he's my younger brother, Tyler Rowley, who drafted a book that has taken him to the top of the Catholic intellectual field, coordinating with some of the most serious Catholic minds in the country, published by Ignatius Press, featured on platforms like EWTN and Relevant Radio, even mentions on places like the National Review and Fox News Podcast. The title is Because of Our Fathers, and it examines the crucial role and responsibility that fathers possess, much more than you moms, in terms of passing the Catholic faith down to their children. We're talking about the generational transmission of the faith and why men and masculinity are so crucial in the raising of our kids, and why God is called Father. Come take a look.
Here is a book that I think ought to be in every home library.
You see, a woman who is single at age 40, having spent 10 or 20 years raising children, is really not quite the same as a man of age 40 who's been working continuously for 20 years.
This should be the show. This is the show.
What?
Just talk.
But it's clear through these tapes, it's clear through Planned Parenthood's own numbers that they're not about healthcare, they're about abortion. That's their thing.
Look at this lead pencil. There's not a single person in the world who could make this pencil. Remarkable statement? Not at all.
You are a liar.
Radical meaning not just extreme politics, what they believe in, but how far they're willing to go to win elections. And thuggery, lying and cheating and stealing are things that they've proven over and over again that they're willing to do.
All right, we mustn't kid ourselves into thinking that the communists have placed their agitators only into the black communities. They're working both sides of the street. They want hatred, violence, and bloodshed between the races, and they don't care how they get it or whom they use, even children if necessary.
You're black or you're white, you're Latino or you're transsexual or you're homosexual or whatever. You're a group. You're a member of a group.
British government wasn't stabbing us in the gut with bayonets. They were oppressing us with taxes and regulations. That's what we meant by tyranny 250 years ago.
I want the people of America to be able to work less for the government and more for themselves. This is the chief meaning of freedom.
I think we're talking at cross purposes.
Eternal law is the mind of God. The natural law is a participation in the eternal law or a reflection of it.
All that is necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing.
See if you can be some kind of hero. Make the suffering in the world less.
This is the show, and we're not going to change it.
All right, welcome to Good Men, host Travis Rowley. As you have learned in the intro, today's guest is Tyler Rowley, younger brother by several years. Tyler got a book published by Ignatius Press, Because of Our Fathers. 23 Catholics tell how their fathers led them to Christ, and it's about the generational transmission of faith, particularly dealing with fathers being most important, passing religion down to their sons and into the generations. Tyler, good morning.
Good morning, brother.
This is what I've been thinking the most about is this is not going to be like, it's going to have to be more of a conversation than an interview because
I won't let you interview me.
Can't do like a professional voice because it's Like, I'll just, once I make eye contact. Actually, no, and this got me thinking, okay, we'll start with, this got me thinking about, I was going to make kind of a joke about how we used to get in trouble at church, and if we were bad in church, we had to go to our rooms for an hour when we got home. Like, church is an hour, you were bad in church, go to your room for an hour. And one time I was sitting like right next to Dad, and we were goofing off, and he squeezed my leg so hard that I thought it was going to snap off. And I was like, and I was going to kind of make a joke like, is that what you mean about the importance of the father? But then in the very, I got to go to the back here, when you actually mention our dad at the end of your book, you say, you basically send a shout out to him. I thank God for having given me a father and mother, James and Deborah, who rightly ordered my mind to love God above all things. I'm fortunate and indeed blessed to have their witness of marriage and devotion to the one true faith. My family's commitment to the church has grown considerably since we were children, motivated in large part by our youngest brother's ordination to the priesthood, but in no small part due also to the consistent witness of a committed father who got on his knees each Sunday in front of his 4 sons. Without a weekly reminder of the strength and transcendence of God, it is likely our religious commitment would be significantly different today. My brothers and I are all intentional Catholics today because of our father. And then I started thinking, oh, maybe it's not such a joke, because you read a lot of the stories and the testimonies in the book, and a lot of the things that the contributors do is they mention the small things, not necessarily like squeezing their son's leg to the point where this 8-year-old was in a lot of pain, but a lot of it was like, my dad would hand me his glasses. My dad would put me on his shoulders. And even something as small as seeing your dad get on his knees is, I wanted to kind of start out with that and be like, is this really about child psychology and just what they're absorbing through witnessing their dad do all these small things?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is. That's true, that a lot of the contributors are, you can sort of just see in their reflection, like these small things that they remember their fathers doing. Like, my dad used to get on his knees every single Sunday. That has just like this infusion of grace into you. Like it's a simple thing. It's like, oh, you're going to church, okay, but the fact that dad is taking the time to do it, dad is getting on his knees, which is just a very obvious sign that the biggest and strongest guy in your life is admitting, if not with his words, with his body, that he is not the biggest and strongest thing in your life. There's actually something way above him, to the point where he is getting down on your knees is many times an act of worship. So that just has like this osmosis effect, I think, of just instilling the faith into the children. And and that's exactly what I meant when I said that. And I actually remember the exact time you're talking about at Mass that me and you specifically got in a ton of trouble. We just like took it to the next level at one Mass. Like, we were just not going to care what they thought.
We always sat in the back for this reason.
Yeah, and when we got home, I remember he made you do yard work, and he told me to go up to my room, and similar to how he squeezed your leg, like, I got a beating, and I deserved it. And I remember the lesson was like, why did I think I could like mock my dad for an hour? But that's, mom didn't do that. Dad did it. That was the justice that is indicative of God the Father, right? So like, God is justice and he is mercy. Our parents usually showed us mercy, but when we deserved it, they showed us justice. And children know that. Like, children know, my 5-year-old knows when he deserves to, get hit or punished. It's not like they, if you're doing it in a godly way, they recognize the justice in it. So just that, just having 2 parents, and then having parents who show you the mercy and the justice at the appropriate times, like, that is the most basic theological lesson that the kid is getting from age 2, 3, 4, 5. That's all being absorbed into what God is like. And this is obviously the problem when children don't have that. They don't get the justice when they need it. They don't get the mercy from the Father when they need it. So they have no vision of their own Father, so they can't have a vision of God the Father. And and you just always go back to the Holy Family, right? That's why I talk about the Holy Family a lot in the beginning. Like the Holy Family, Mary, Joseph, Jesus, is the model. It's not the exception for how we're supposed to raise. Like Jesus is God, and God the Father gives us the model family for us to emulate. So without that dynamic, things break down. So that's a point of the book that we talk about, the societal impact of the breakdown of the family, but then even more to the point of the book is the spiritual breakdown and the breakdown of the church when children aren't raised the right way, basically.
Yeah, again, it's my brother Tyler Rowley, who wrote this book because of our fathers. You jumped around in a lot of different spots. I wanted to kind of start out with a real child psychological angle from this, because we're not really talking about young adults who can now delve into the intellectualism of the faith. We're talking about kind of like, before you're out of the house. I mean, the best observation you make in the book, I think, is Joseph. That I think you said just like this, if there's any family that doesn't need a father involved, it would be the Holy Family. Mary and Jesus, you would think wouldn't need that father figure. But the first thing that God does is make sure that there's a father figure in even Jesus's life. So can you
exactly.
That?
Yeah, that's kind of like sort of a spiritual insight, but it's pretty common sense when I did some reflecting on the Holy Family, obviously, because if you're going to write a Catholic book on fatherhood, obviously the best thing to pray on and reflect on and contemplate is the Holy Family. Like, okay, so if God became a man, what was the model in which he was raised? And it's striking. Obviously, I don't remember ever sort of learning this specific point, but it's striking how Joseph is kept there intentionally. And what's interesting is the scriptures, the gospel writers give Joseph an out. It's not like he couldn't have walked away and still been a righteous man. It says, like, in his righteousness, he was going to put Mary away, and walk away from the situation. There was nothing wrong with that. That would have been completely a normal and just thing to do based on what he was experiencing. But even in those circumstances, God pulls him back into the Holy Family and creates this model of family life. And what's interesting, sort of when you think about the family, like we sort of take the family for granted. Like, okay, you have a dad, you have a mom, and you have kids. Like I said, we sort of take that for granted in the sense that it doesn't have to be like that. Like, why does some guy who impregnates a woman have to stick around and raise that kid? Like, where do we even get the notion that is so matter of fact? Like, oh, of course he's going to stick around. And this sort of gets to the heart of why we call God Father in the first place, right? So this is like a really deep theological point that in our culture, which, just understands nothing about, theology, understands nothing about scripture, we just see God, God is called Father. That must be because the biblical writers were, misogynists. But no, not a
toxic masculine types.
Right. Toxic masculinity. This is indicative of a culture that subdued women. It's what's striking is that's actually the opposite of that. The biblical writers, in their inspiration, understood that calling God the Father was crucial to protecting women and children. The family is what protects women and children. So what we call the patriarchy, today, and we say that with disdain, like, oh, this patriarchal system. The patriarchal system is what protects women and children more than anything. Christianity is what protects women and children more than anything. Compelling a man who could simply impregnate a woman and then walk away, but compelling him to stick around and raise his family is the thing that protects women and children more than anything.
That's more biblical psychology. You know, there could probably be several good reasons why is God a he? Why couldn't he be a she? You know, the assumption by a lot of our friends and a lot of people today is probably that, like, oh, because back then they weren't as progressive. It took 2,000 years for us to start, you know, getting the gender equality thing right. But, you know, and what I've always heard is that, which made a lot of sense as far from a psychological perspective, is that men are different from women, you know, and men need to be controlled. It's not an unfair thing to say that men can be dangerous. I mean, men need to be raised a certain way, because we can be very evil, and we can be very good in the protectors that we're capable of being. And if God is a she, he needs to be afraid. It's just, are teenage boys afraid of their mother on the level that they're afraid of their father? No. So men, you know, I've heard it explained this way, like, if God is a she, that can have a drastic effect on the psychology of the men following that religion. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's one of the main reasons that the God as father sort of has this it bends the male aggression away from violence and towards the family, or towards pro-social institutions, because men and women are very different. Men tend towards violence, and men tend towards just a sexual drive that has no connection to a child. So calling God Father has a submissive effect on the man, because if God the Father is forgiving and merciful and just, well, then that's a lesson for the man that he should be forgiving, merciful, and just. If it's just a woman or a female deity that is merciful and just, well, yeah, that's females, but that's not for the man. So that, calling God Father has this sort of bends his natural aggression away from that, and makes him more like God the Father.
And that would be where people like us would assume, like, that's part of the inspiration of the writing of the Bible. Like, it's an intentional, you know, God is the father, not the mother. It's not some sort of backwards culture that, oh, of course God's a he, because, you know, women are just, you know, second-class citizens. It'd be like an
it's not that at all. It's exactly under the inspiration. You know, St. Thomas Aquinas always uses the word fittingness, that it's more fitting to call God Father for these reasons. And there are other reasons too, like he's the first cause of the creation, right? So if you think about the sexual act, the man is the first cause of the creation of a child. God is the first cause of all creation. But one thing that we should definitely point out is that God is not a father or a mother, like in a literal human sense. God is not a man or a woman, right? God transcends these things. These things are used by humans, using our best language to best understand what God is like. Jesus was a man. Jesus was a human man, and that was most fitting. It was most fitting for Jesus to be a man. And you can go through all theological reasons. I think one of the main reasons is that because one of the most Christian characteristics of the Father is a self-sacrificial person. The person who's a servant to all others and who sacrifices himself for all others is the role of the man, is the role of the Father, and that's why Jesus is the second person of the Trinity, is presented to us as a man who takes on those characteristics and shows us that on the cross and through his life. But that's not to say that God doesn't have, you know, these female characteristics, and that he's nurturing, he's loving, he's forgiving. God transcends these things, but Jesus gives us a model in his own self, him being a man and him calling God the Father. And then the church teaches us why these words are the most fitting. And they have practical theological reasons and they have practical sociological reasons. And, you know, women who understand this aren't offended by this. It's only sort of this, like, this radical egalitarian, feminist that doesn't try to understand these things, doesn't understand how they actually benefit her life. And she just kind of stands on the shoulders of the giants who thought these things out and who created these great civilizations based on these ideas of God the Father and Christianity. And then sort of just attacks them from this, from this irrational standpoint.
Your book doesn't focus on this type of theology, but as you're reading it, your mind goes there. At least mine does. With everything going on in 2020 with the Black Lives Matter and Antifa, you start relating what you're reading to what's going on around you in the world currently. And and we're going to get into the contributors and more about the content in the book, but we've already kind of just gone down this path. Let me read this real quick. Yeah. I have a book near me that gets to the point of what we were talking about, is God the Father. So this might sum up the point pretty well. This is actually called Calling God Father by John Miller. Essays on the Bible, Fatherhood, and Culture. So he kind of sums up this point. He says, this fact, as much as any other, may help explain why we are taught to call God Father. It is not because fathers are more important for children than mothers, and it is certainly not because men are superior to women and thus more deserving of being divinized as a byproduct of our language for God. It is rather because across human societies, fatherhood is far weaker and more fragile than motherhood. I do not believe, and I know Professor Miller, the author of the book, does not believe that men need God more than women do. But I do suspect that fathers need more reminding from God than mothers do. Perhaps calling God Father is, in part, just such a reminder. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a good summary of kind of what I would say you really have to, the toxic masculinity thing, when I really think about it, I almost think there's, it's left-wing garbage, but it's almost like there's a fair enough thing there, because men can be so evil, and there's no shortage of examples, and you have to cultivate manhood so carefully. Like, I think what we just heard is that fatherhood is more fragile. Like men are tempted to leave. They're, I assume they're referring to like the mother's love for this child, which is different from the father's love for the child, right? Men can do like horrible things, and if it's not cultivated properly, if they're not scared to death of God, which I think is one of the 7 virtues, fear of God. Like, that's a good thing. That's a virtuous thing, to be afraid. And God the Father makes more sense than God the Mother in that sense. It's more, what was the word that Aquinas used? Fitting.
Right. There's I actually have a interesting story happened last week. I had an appliance guy come over the house. We had a problem with our washing machine. So he came over the house, and the kids were all in the house, and I could tell that he was a father himself. Obvious that he had some children, and he did. He had 3 children. So we started talking, and he said that he was one of 10, or he said that his father had 10 children. And I knew by the way he said it was sort of a abnormal situation. Mm-hmm. So we kind of pressed him on it, and he said, yeah, well, my father had 10 children with 5 different women. And I said, wow. I said, do those 10 children like have a relationship with him? And he said, every single one except for me hates him. He has no relationship with any of them except for me. And he said, and I only forgave him and started a relationship with him when I became a Christian. You have this one who has this different perspective on it, but it's only because he came to God the Father. And you maybe make the assumption that he only really came to God the Father and ended up forgiving his father, because those are the characteristics of God the Father in Christianity, that he's loving and forgiving. So you can't come to God and not become like God. We can, like, what do you think is more effective? just take this kid who's growing up with just his mom in the household. He has no dad. He has no relationship with his dad. We could, like, someone might say, all right, well, this is kind of just false hope. Like, you think that bringing because God is a father, that's sort of going to have some sort of effect on this child. And some might call it, this false hope. But, what's more of a false hope? Like throwing more welfare programs at him and social workers at him and volunteers at him and making sure his mom makes more money at her job or there's more opportunities for her. Is that false hope, or is giving him a faith that extends to fatherless children the covenant of fatherhood, like the Christian covenant of fatherhood, the Christian idea, and a relationship with God the Father? Like, which one of those would you rather do for the kid? Like, just throw social programs at him and help his mom, and hopefully he rises above this father wound, or actually give him Christ, or actually give him God the Father? And that's why I just thought of remember that story a couple of years ago in the Providence school system? Like, I think the two stories coincided. We were all learning like how absolutely abysmal the Providence school system was. Like, it couldn't have been like more of a nightmare what they were uncovering. And then there was this story that coincided where there was this book that was recommended for fall reading or summer reading.
Yeah, remind me what that was.
Yeah, it was a book by like this black guy who kind of rose above the way that he was raised, and he became really successful, and he talks moderately about like his relationship with God in the book. Like, there was some passing
book. Yeah.
And the school system, like, teachers went nuts, and it was canceled. They'd spent like $150,000 on buying the books, and then it wasn't recommended reading for the kids. And it was like, okay, so like you have all these kids who you're not educating. You're terrible teachers. They're not getting an education. A lot of them are growing up in these broken homes, so they're not getting the spiritual lesson of fatherhood. And then along comes a book that might have like the lesson of fatherhood in there, and the lesson of God and who Christ is, and they go nuts. And it's like, we can't have it.
Yeah, and take the religion out of it for a second. And obviously, it's very Christ-centered and very Catholic, your book. But just break it down to what these secularists are concerned with, which is getting a good education and a good job and creating opportunity for these kids. And we know that, and you spell it out, like forget about the Catholic thing for a second. Just the sociological studies scream that fatherlessness is going to be a huge detriment. It's the biggest predictor of your child not graduating, going to jail, not having a job. All the social problems that the left complains about starts with that, correct?
Yeah, so I came up with an acronym to help myself remember some of the statistics, because they're all staggering when you take fatherlessness into account, what happens to children. But remember PSP. So remember PSP, that's poverty, school dropout, prison. Poverty, school dropout, prison, and then it goes 5, 10, 20. 5 times more likely, 10 times more likely, 20 times more likely. So the kid who grows up without the father is 5 times more likely to be in poverty, 10 times more likely to drop out of school, and 20 times more likely to go to prison. PSP. But even suicide, abortion, everything skyrockets.
Encouraging fatherhood. Okay, I can see a lot of secularists kind of getting on board with that when you show them the sociological studies. But then where does the Christian Catholicism come down on top of that and say, well, this is really the linchpin. This is what keeps fathers around. This is the father passing down lessons, cultural lessons, no more cultural forgetfulness, like you're saying. And that's ultimately the reason the imitation of Christ, that fathers are going to stay around and do the right thing by the mother. Is that what you're kind of saying?
Yeah, exactly. So you can talk about the sociological impact, but okay, I mean, how do you, and this is kind of how I think about everything. Like, to me, every single political issue always boils down to what do you believe about the world? Like, what do you believe about existence? Do you believe in God? Do you not believe in God? Are you a Christian? Like, what sort of worldview do you have? Because we can talk about, PSP and 5 times and 20 times more likely, but if your worldview is one that doesn't really care about that, or isn't.
That's always where my mind goes. I'm always thinking, because we know so many, at least lapsed Catholics and or semi-atheist friends of ours, because that's just where the world, America, is at this point anyway. So I'm always thinking about, how do I tell people to read this book when there's almost like a prerequisite that you have to at least believe in God or be somewhat Christian before you kind of even go here. You know what I mean? So I'm always thinking, how do you talk to these leftists,
Yeah, the book, I would say the book isn't necessarily written for leftists. The book is written for that guy who who you grew up with, who, if you asked him, if you were out at a bar with him and someone, religion came up, he'd say, yeah, I'm Catholic. Mm-hmm. So he wants to say he's Catholic. He probably had all his children baptized, probably goes to church on Christmas and Easter, doesn't want to give up the identity of being Catholic, but for all intents and purposes, his relationship with God is non-existent. He doesn't pray. He doesn't go to confession. He doesn't believe in the sacraments. He might loosely believe in the existence of God, but he doesn't really know who Christ is. He doesn't really understand the theological teachings on Christ.
It's culturally culturally Christian, but the theology and the intellectualism of it is all lost.
Right. So to that person, I'm saying, okay, you need to know, Tom, that the way that you're living, you may think it's okay for you. Like, you may think that, if there is an afterlife, you're in pretty good shape, which I would argue with that anyways. But let's just say you think it's okay for you. But based on your example, your children are going to care far less than you about their Catholic identity. They're not going to say they're Catholic, in 20 years when they're out with their friends at a bar. And your grandchildren are almost certain to not be baptized at all, have no relationship with God. So you are the person who's going to cause your children and your grandchildren to lose the faith. Now, what's interesting is, okay, now that's forward thinking about your children, your grandchildren. But let's think backwards for a second. How did you become Catholic? Well, my dad is pretty serious. Oh yeah, how about your grandfather? Oh, he was really devout. Oh, how about your great-great-grandfather? Oh, from what I know, we had a ton of, Irish priests and nuns in the family. It's like, yeah, your faith probably goes back to St. Patrick. The Catholicism probably runs in your family for 1,700 years. Isn't it interesting that Tom, in 2020 are going to be the one who just gives it up? And here's the question. You can give it up. If it's not true, give it up. Stop teaching your kids things that are false. I'm all for that. Mm-hmm. But shouldn't you find out if it's true or not? And that's what conservatives, Catholics, what I've always respected about those intellectual groups is that they welcome the challenge of just laying the cards out on the table and seeing who believes in it, because they truly believe that they have the better ideas.
At one point, in your introduction, I was kind of waiting for it, and it was about halfway through or more toward the end of your introduction to the book where you kind of just go all Tyler, like evangelical, and be like, by the way, the number one reason why you should be Catholic is because it's true. It's like I just want to remind everyone that I'm not just spouting off what might be good for the Catholic Church. It's the reason I'm actually doing that is because you should believe in it and investigate it. And
it's not about getting our numbers up in the Catholic Church. And I think some people in the church think like that. Like, this is about, it's a social group, and how do we get more members? We have to have, more lively music, and it's like, no. How do we get more people who believe that Jesus Christ is God incarnate, and that our actions matter, that we're fallen from sin, that there's a first cause of the universe, God created us, he revealed himself through Christ, and you can only get to him if you're like him, and you may spend eternity separated from God. How do we get people to believe those things? Because those are the things that Christ was really specific about people needing to believe in order to change the dynamic of their heart in order to be with him forever. It's interesting. Like a lot of people today can't believe in anything unless they understand everything. And I don't know the psychology of how that came about. It probably has something to do with this radical scientism that we've gotten into. Like, I can't believe anything unless I can test it and repeat it through a scientific method. But the word mystery is a really important word in the Catholic Church. We don't pretend that we need to understand absolutely everything about the world in order to understand some things, and then in order to be passionate about those things. And it only makes sense. Like, why do we have to evangelize other people? And why do we have to save other people? God could do that by himself. Okay, sure, he could, but that's not what seems to have happened.
That wasn't the instruction, right?
Through the life of Christ. And if we could only understand everything about the world, that means that God is only as smart as me.
Yeah.
And that's hardly a God that you'd want to worship if he's only as transcendent and intelligent as me. So we have to
You're reminding me of like the scientists. I think Einstein was one of them, who the deeper they went searching for knowledge, the more you would think these would be the people that would be the least humble and like, oh, I understand more than anybody. But the deeper you go into the sciences, the more amazed they get and the more miracles they see. You know, and we're not. It's probably a good thing that we don't know everything and aren't on that plateau of knowledge, right? Where there's nothing more to know from a human psychological.
Yeah. I mean, I think logically, it's not even possible. Yeah. And I think you just have to. Another key word in the church is humility, right? So we don't understand everything. We don't need to understand everything. I remember there was a time in I was in a class, RCIA class. I was sitting in on an RCIA class because a priest that I really liked was teaching it. And one of the women in there, who she was kind of considering coming into the church, but she wasn't really sure, but she was taking the classes, and she sort of just kind of had this moment where we were talking about salvation and the necessity to be Catholic for your salvation. And her dad had died years before, and I don't think he was a Catholic. And it just sort of bothered her personally that she couldn't, if she became Catholic, she couldn't really have this assurance that he was in heaven. And that was kind of what was holding her back from entering the church. And I remember kind of explaining to her what we just talked about, like the humility of Catholicism, the mystery that we admit exists. And what I said, like a lot of other religions, a lot of other worldviews will just tell you what you want to hear. Oh, your dad was probably a good man. He's probably in heaven, right? And the Catholic Church never says anything that they can't know, right? That was one of the things that drew me to the Catholic Church. They don't just give you answers because they know that answer is going to comfort you. They stop short whenever they reach a point where knowledge is unattainable for them. And that's attractive if you care about truth, right? And it doesn't help anybody, this false sense of charity that we have where, you go to any funeral today and the priest talks about how the person, he's definitely in heaven looking down upon us. No, he's not. He's not definitely in heaven. Right. He's just not. So like true.
And people respond to that, because when the culture particularly is feminized like that and telling you what you want to hear, you find out ironically all the time that people want to be given the truth, the harsh truth, and you get more response from that. Going back to what you're saying about, we need better music in mass, all of a sudden it's like there's something inside humans that respect tradition and the organs and things like that speak to universal truths, not some sort of political fad that seems cool on Facebook. All of a sudden it's like you just find that out over and over again. You find it out when you find the courage to speak the truth sometimes, where you post something and it'll be and you'll see like all these people respond to it, like I believe that too. There's so when you just kind of not necessarily speak the truth, but speak your mind. People
if you're not it. Yeah, Eric Sammons is a guy that I follow on the internet. He's a really good Catholic apologist, and he said recently he just put out a tweet. It said, "If you're not offending someone in this culture, you're not Catholic."
Yeah.
You know, and it's true. It's like, yeah, like how could you possibly be living the Catholic faith in this culture right now and not be called a hateful, bigoted, you know, backwards thinking person? Like you,
right. Why is it though? Did you come across any answers of why what the mother does isn't as important as what the father does in terms of growing up thinking I'm Catholic too?
Right. That's a question in and of itself that in the whole book that this might be the best paragraph that gets at that specific question. It comes from Father Scalia's essay on page 71. So this is what Father Paul Scalia, he's the son of late Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia. I think he had 9 children. Paul, I'm not sure where Paul falls, but he became a priest. He's a priest in the Archdiocese of down in DC, somewhere around there. But he says, Father Scalia says, fatherhood is always caught up with bestowing an identity on one's children. The identity we receive from mom is organic and instinctive. The identity from dad must be more deliberately given and received. Patrimony indicates the inheritance of wisdom and knowledge that we received from our ancestors. It gives us an identity and keeps us from being historical orphans, isolated in our own little blip of time. The word patrimony comes from the Latin patris and munus, the father's duty. It is indeed his duty to give his children an identity so that they know their place in the world. So I think that gets at it. You know, I think there's more sort of psychology that you need to kind of unveil to sort of understand why the parents are more inclined to follow the father than the mother.
What I was surprised with is that every single one of the 23 contributors to the book, who all do like kind of like a 3,000-word essay about how their father led them to Christ, and they were strong Catholics, which is why they're strong Catholics. And you have this great network across the country of these just top-notch intellectuals, and you reached out to them. And that's how you kind of formulated the book to begin with. My observation was that they're all really good writers. Like, not everyone who's a radio personality and is smart, obviously, is a good writer, but they're all very well written. And I think you told me that you didn't really edit them. They were all kind of handed in as is, right?
Yeah, well, I needed to edit Tony Esselin's a lot.
Yeah. The professor. No, you have people like Esselin in the book and Scalia, these names, and you know, a lot of them are Catholic names that a lot of people won't recognize, but you know, but then you have some real, you know, some more normal folk, I would just say. And actually, we're going to interview Megan Riley next week because the story she tells of her father is pretty awesome. The pro-life angle.
Oh yeah, that's one of the best ones in the book. Yeah, I mean, first of all, yeah, there's a lot of Catholic intellectuals who are the contributors. So those ones, yeah, there was very little editing. So the process was we sort of talked about what the book was, what their essays should basically be about. As the editor, I'm trying to stay out of it as much as possible and not like put them into a box and like do it like this. I'm just trying to, basically it's like the book is because of our fathers. It's Catholics tell how their fathers led them to Christ. Go for it.
And they didn't need to do anything else, because that was another observation I made about the book, is that you write this like really strong introduction that had the data, the study out of Switzerland, I think, that showed like, listen, like, 2 generations of fathers that kind of slip away from the faith, and you can just crush that Catholic culture entirely. Like you said, you can be the father that is ultimately responsible for hundreds, if not thousands, of years of your family losing the religion, right? And then it just goes into these strong Catholics telling their story about their dad, and they didn't really have to get that deep into the theology and the philosophy. They just said, like, this is what my dad did. But it follows your data and your argumentation, and it just makes for like a really strong book. And then you kind of finish it off with the introduction. But you started the book off with, you might have done this on purpose. If not, it was kind of genius, because one of the strongest stories in the book comes from Mr. Castillo. And it just in a sense that after you read it, you want to read the other ones. So do you want to kind of go into the Castillo story?
Yeah, the reason I put that first, it was intentional, and Ignatius Press agreed that it should go first. And because the consensus was that who that story is about, which is it's about John Castillo. This one's sort of unique in that the author, John Castillo, he's really talking about two people. He's talking about his father, and he's talking about his son too, because his son died in a school shooting in Colorado in 2019. So Kendrick was 18 years old. He rushed the front of the school, the front of the classroom when a shooter had a gun. The shooter's plan was to execute all the kids in his classroom as they were on their knees. And Kendrick was the one who had the bravery, the courage, and the love for his classmates to rush the shooter. He ends up getting shot and dies. Two other male students are able to subdue him. But not only is he, that's like a good American story, right? Like, see, he's just a hero in like the American sense of the word, but he's, a martyr too in the Catholic sense of the word. And martyrdom is really the end. That's like the end goal of the Catholic life. Like, do you love people enough to die for them? Do you love God enough to die for him? And because of that, Kendrick just embodies the Christ-like figure. He gave his life for his friends. He's a hero. He's a martyr. So that's why his story was put first. And John's essay is awesome. He talks about how his dad, like all the things that his dad did, the hunting trips, the camping trips, they used to take Kendrick on those trips ever since he was 3 years old. This was their only child. So I got into some personal conversations with John. He had, and I actually think he talks about some of this in the book. They had a miscarriage. They had trouble conceiving. And then Kendrick was like this miracle for him and his wife, Maria. And they just this essay just like overflows with like how much John and loved Kendrick. It was like just the center of their life. At one point he talks about how Maria walks around the house now and just like kisses pictures of Kendrick because she misses him so much. And I remember he told me that on the phone the first time I talked to him.
It's kind of the saddest story in the book too, but it just, and here's why I brought up your introduction, because not you, but Mr. Castillo contrasts his son and his character with the two school shooters that day who were, in terms of their father figures in their life, were the complete opposite. So can you talk about who they were too, the shooters?
Yeah, that was an awesome part. So I talked to John on the phone about this, and I said to him, do you know anything about the fathers of the other two kids? And he did. I mean, he was completely immersed in the court cases and finding out what happened to these kids and what happened to his son. So he knew all about the backstories of these kids. And I think I said to him on the phone, let me guess, no fathers, broken homes, terrible situations. And he said, yeah, absolutely. One of them was adopted, right? So we encourage adoption. Adoption is a good thing. But the reality of adoption is that you're abandoned by your parents, right? So in some way. I mean, it can be a heroic abandonment, in the case of, a mother who really doesn't think she can raise her kids, but there's still a sense in the kid that, my mom and my dad, aren't raising me, right? So that's one of the kids. And even the adoptive parents, in that case, there was problems there, a lot of neglect there. Mm-hmm. The other kid had you couldn't even like draw up a worse father relationship. He was a addict, and he was a criminal, and he abused the mom, and he was arrested multiple times. And then really mysteriously, that student is a girl who is pretending to be a boy. So this is like a transgender situation. Yeah. That's how deep the father wound went there. She wrote on Twitter like 11 days before how she missed her father. So these two students have these like deep father wounds. They have this resentment, and that's why they're friends. They leave class. They do drugs in one of their homes. Then they set one of the mother's cars on fire. They write 666 on the garage wall. And a pentagram. So like all this like satanic, violent, weird stuff, drugs, and then guns, and then they walk to the school, and they're just going to kill like 40 people.
Yeah. And just kind of share their pain with the rest of the school.
Yeah, exactly. You have this like clash between like these like satanically led students and this like Christ-like figure in Kendrick, and they just clash on this day, and that's what the end.
And I was just thinking
of the Christian life.
Contrasting those students that came together that day would almost be like a cheap shot, but because it followed your introduction that gave the data and the statistics and talked about the Catholic culture and what we're trying to save here, and it's not like Mr. Castillo harped on it, or he just kind of mentions it in passing, that these two students, this was their situation in life. I'm telling you about my son, and it would have almost felt like, oh, what are you trying to say? That like kids who don't have the perfect situation or bad kids are going to grow up to be these type of people. But after your introduction, it made it that much more powerful. And so did all the rest of the contributors. Like they're just talking about their dads and the little things he did that affected them going forward as when they're adults. And it just made it way more powerful. And then now I'm thinking about the statistic about the school shooters, because you can.
Yeah, it's also a completely valid point, because I don't know of one school shooter who lived with his dad in a normal circumstance.
Yeah, and I bet you 9 out of 10 people have never heard this statistic, that I think it's 30 out of the last 30 prominent school shootings in the United States, the shooter's relationship with the father was like non-existent or something like that.
Yeah, I think they were not raised by their fathers in the same home, and that's the key statistic. We're going to talk about statistics that we need to improve in the country. That's the one. You need to be raised in the same home with your dad, not just like have a relationship on the weekends with him, but he's there to model the fatherhood of God and to give you the mercy and the justice that are appropriate and that model God the Father.
You think about all these people focusing on the gun, after this, and it's that glaring, like what type of gun is the gun of choice for school shooters? And now I'm thinking about the profile of the kids, which is usually white, upper middle class kids that shoot up these schools. And then we were talking about Black Lives Matter. And that's the other story I wanted to mention, was going back to what, the beginning of the interview was, I remember the Baltimore Freddie Gray 5 or 6 years ago incident when these mostly young black males in Baltimore are challenging the police and throwing rocks and all in masks. And this one mother comes out of nowhere and she grabs her like 15-year-old son by the ear, and all the cameras are focusing on it. And they made this mother out to be like a saint. And this was the story of, they glorified kind of like this single mother. Like, that's a parent right there. You see what she's doing? She's a real hero. And I'm like, how could there be, like, there's this huge story going on, which is thousands of young black males throwing rocks at cops. And you're going to say that the story here is the one mother who showed up? And it just goes back to what I was saying is that that is very rare, because once your kid hits 12, let alone 15, 16, 17, 18, the mother is not. Can you imagine mom trying to control the 4 of us without dad? I mean, that's the classic line. It's wait till your father gets home. That's all she had. Ultimately, it was like, wait till your father gets home. And
she used to call him when she used to beep him when we were there.
With the beepers. That's right. Yeah. No. But it crosses it. But we don't have to focus on young black kids. That's a particular problem, I think. But look at the last 30 school shooters. They're all white kids that have father issues. And so it just goes back to what you were saying. It was why, if you read the reviews of your book, at least a lot of the people who've read your book are talking about the timeliness of it. Like, oh my God, we need this book like right now. I mean, you could actually make the argument that the book is too late because we've been watching this for decades. Not that it's too little, but it's too late, it doesn't matter what race you look at. It just goes back to these fundamentals, these Catholic fundamentals, going back to Joseph and the creation of the Holy Family.
Yeah. And it's just thinking about that. I know exactly what clip you're talking about with that, when that mom did that. And it was sort of this awesome moment but like, how many mothers have she was like this like strong-willed, powerful mom who like just wasn't going to take any BS from her kid. But like, she is an outlier of any sort of normalcy in a single parent household. And like, good for her for doing it. But yeah, like the bigger story is like, why are all these kids raised in homes without dads? Where are all the dads grabbing the kid, not by the ear, but grabbing him in a headlock and dragging him out. The truth is that the kids wouldn't be like, if you have a dad who gives you order in the household and gives you justice in the household, you're not out doing that. You're just not like out. And I think I said this to Tim Gordon when I was on his show. I said, I would absolutely love to see somebody do like a statistical analysis of like all the people who have thrown rocks at police in the last year at these riots, and what percentage of them grew up in a normal household with their father, with the father who created them. And I bet it's next to zero. And that's what one of the things that the family does, the model family, the model through the Holy Family, is it gives order. Like there's an order to the family, and order gives peace. And in peace, you can contemplate the larger truths of life. But if you don't have order and you don't have peace, you don't even have the time as a kid or a young adult to think about the larger truths in life. Like, who am I? Who is God? Do I want to have a relationship with God? What am I supposed to do with my life? Not like what job am I supposed to have? Like, look, who are you in the deepest sense, and what are you supposed to do in the deepest sense? And that's what a family does. It's the order of things. And I really think like there is a certain segment of our political makeup in this country, of political leaders, who don't want that order. That order is catastrophic to them, because order creates all of this peace in the family and this time to contemplate what is truly good for you. And with that, you come out being much more conservative values, much more traditional, much more religious. But it's these things like abortion and contraception and surrogacy and homosexuality and divorce that they do everything they can to make access to these things a lot easier. And all of these things, the thing they have in common is they create less families. Like that's what all of those things do. They create less families.
That's not even guesswork. I mean, Black Lives Matter website, everyone kind of knows this now in our circles anyway, that Black Lives Matter admits we seek to destroy the Western family. You know, they admit that's the enemy of what we want. And you can go back to Karl Marx, who thought the enemy was the true enemy of the people was the family structure. That needed to be broken down first. Christianity needed to be busted up. And then you get the neo-communists 100 years later, follow the wall, but they kind of repackage themselves as these progressive Democrats. And look at what they're doing. We got Rachel Maddow talking about, a few years ago, she came out with this scary commercial that was like, we need to realize that children are not the property of their parents. The children belong to all of us. It's just like, they don't belong to the family. Like that's a really scary statement. And just they're out there telling us at this point, they're infecting. If they can't get at your family, they're going into where you send your kids, which is the school. I mean, it was Bill Ayers that said, education is the motor force for revolution. I mean, Ayers is a secular atheist radical. They know if we can't get into the family or break up the family, we go to the schools. I mean, I don't know how you can deny that there's this overt attack to get your kids.
Yeah, and the term, I think that the Black Lives Matter came out and just said like, we want to disrupt the Western family. And then the other term they use is to reimagine the family, right? They want to reimagine the police.
Yeah.
They also want to reimagine the family. And what that means is like, wait a second, we need to break out of this taking for granted of mom, dad, plus kids in one household. And in one sense, they're right, in the sense that it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be that way. That's what we talked about at the beginning of the show. Fathers don't need to stick around. But you watch what happens when you truly get a culture to reimagine the family, and you get rid of the Western notion of the family, and you truly have the norm is no longer for the man-woman lifelong relationship, creating children, staying in their lives their whole lives. You wait to see the destruction that you bring down. And then you think, wait a second, don't they know that's going to happen? And the answer is probably yes. They do know that. They do know that's going to happen.
And we don't need any more proof. We've already seen what the breakdown of the family has done to certain segments of our society. Like, what is this? what is this experimentation? Or like, we'll see what happens. Like, we know, we've been watching it for 50 years.
Right.
And it goes back to, before we wrap it up, it goes back to your observation about St. Joseph. It's just like, gee, if there was ever a family that didn't need a father, it was Jesus and Mary. Like, they're going to be fine. But for some reason, God says he invites Joseph into that package. And then the way you open up the book, I'll just read it again. The family is the basis in the Lord's plan, and all the forces of evil aim to demolish it. Uphold your families and guard them against the grudges of the evil one by the presence of God. That was by St. Charbel. So this, even though you're talking about a very pointed topic, which is fatherhood and the generational transmission of the faith, you're clearly out there saying and trying to get this point across that the church in general, the family in general, is what's going to save the world or this country, or even your kids' salvation.
Yeah, no, that's it. The point of life is to have peace and happiness, and then to take that peace and happiness with you when you die, to live with God forever. And the only vehicle that can accomplish that is the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is the body of Christ. As broken and as many problems as it has right now, there's men much wiser than me have already have kind of told us what's going to happen with the church. There's going to be a much smaller church, faithful believers who actually want to live the Christian life, who believe in the dogmas of the faith, that are going to sort of remain in the church and build the church back up. And we need as many people doing that as we can. Right now, it's not, it's a very small amount of people who are willing to sacrifice, all that they have, or even a little of what they have, to build the church back up, which is the vehicle to build society back up, which is to give people peace and happiness, and to save them.
If nothing else, even for secular friends of mine, like, it's kind of an inspiring book. Like, it's like you start realizing, your friends who have kids, how important you are, and that can only lead to the next step, which is let me find out why I'm so important. And your faith and mine is that it'll lead into the church. So, and along, just before we wrap it up, I did want to read one thing that you wrote. The world's biggest problem is the ruin of the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church's biggest problem is the ruin of fatherhood. If the church will succeed once again in teaching the gospel to the world, it will need to be led by fathers who may no longer stand by as idle observers as their children are entrapped by the world and led into the destructive vices of secularism and materialism. So I think that kind of is repeating what you had just said in the past minute or so. Is there anything else that you wanted to add before we kind of wrap it up?
No, just that target group that we're talking about. The final word is that you need to have you need to have a conversation with yourself about the Catholicism. If you just want to be a cultural Catholic, okay. The reason for that would be that you don't believe it's true. If you want to have an impact, a spiritual impact on your children, and you want your children to live the Catholic faith, if there's anything in you that wants to retain the faith for your children and your grandchildren, then it's going to come down to you. Now, that you're only going to be impacted by what I just said if you come to the conclusion that Jesus Christ is who he said he is. And this is where I started my faith journey, like 10 years ago. I need to find out if I believe Jesus Christ is who he said he is. If the answer to that is no, then your cultural Catholicism will do just fine. That's fine. Your children and your grandchildren, they'll lose the faith, and you shouldn't really care. But if you come to the conclusion that Jesus Christ is who he said he is, then you need to change the way you're living your Catholic faith, because you're going to lose it for the rest of your family. And that's really who I'm talking to through the book. But I love all these sub conversations about fatherhood in society. But the thrust of the book is that, and that's who really we need to get to read the book. Like that person who's getting married, that person you know who has, was married a few years ago and has a couple kids, but you're pretty sure they're not really they haven't really embraced the Catholic faith, but they sort of identify as Catholic. Well, they need to make a decision. Like, what's your decision? Is Christ who he said he is? Yes or no? Like, let's man up a little bit. That's what fatherhood's about, right? You're a father. You're called to protect your family. You're called to serve your family. You're called to, answer the door at 3 a.m. if you hear a strange knock. Well, in the same sense that you protect your kids' worldly needs, what about their spiritual lives? What about their eternal life? What about their existential thoughts about who they are and what they are? You need to feed those too and nurture those too. So you need to figure out the answers to those questions in order to do that. Declan?
That's little Finn, the 3-year-old. That might be a good way to end it.
Yeah. That's the message.
Let's end it there. When my wife comes in, I'm sure I'm in trouble for something. Probably just for doing this. I'll wrap up and record like a conclusion later.
Hey, Kathy.
You want to say hi, Tyler?
Hey, Ty.
Hey, Kath.
Okay, sorry about that, everyone. Not the way we wanted to end the show. A productive conversation about fathers interrupted by a mother. God's way of reminding everyone of who's truly in charge. No matter, we were wrapping it up anyway. Hope you enjoyed this episode of Good Men. Don't forget to go to tylerrowley.com to learn more and order your copy of Because of Our Fathers, 23 Catholics tell how their fathers led them to Christ. Right now, this good man has got to go.